Did the United States just start an unjust war or prevent a far greater one? Because here's the reality. Operation Epic Fury has reignited one of the oldest and most uncomfortable questions in Christian ethics. When, if ever, is a war justified? Now, some are saying that this is an outright aggression. No direct attack, no justification. Others, though, argue the opposite, that this was necessary, even overdue. So, who's right? And more importantly, how should Christians think about it? Well, hi all, I'm Lenny Esposito, and in this episode, we will see how Christian theology shapes our response to real-world crises. Now, it's clear the Bible teaches thou shalt not kill, but it also says governments bear the sword to punish evil. So, which is it? Well, in this episode, I'm going to take on a recent interview and highlight experts Keith Pavischek and Dr. Milosch, and we're going to break this down in a way that actually makes sense. It's not propaganda, it's not politics, it's a framework that Christians have used actually for centuries. Just war theory. We'll ask, is war ever moral? What are the rules? And does this conflict meet them? Because if we get this wrong, we either justify evil or we allow it to flourish. That's all coming up on this. Come let us reason together. Well, hi everyone. Welcome back to another Come Let Us Reason. And this is a very important episode because we're going to examine the idea behind what constitutes a just war. And it's never been more timely as this question has arisen again with the United States Operation Epic Fury that President Trump launched against Iran on February 28th. So how do we understand this? Who can go to war? And when should we go? Does morality play a part in decisions about war at all? Or is that old aphorism, all's fair in love and war, actually true? Well, at least for the second part of the clause. President Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury has sparked new questions and brought an increased attention to the concept of just war theory or just war tradition. Now, given the fact that there was seemingly no single attack by the Iranians on the United States, well, many hold that we're simply wrong to have initiated the bombing and killing of another sovereign state. Others believe that there's a significant threat that must be handled before a greater tragedy or loss of innocent life results. So, how can Christians make sense of all this? Well, the foundational principles of just war theory are deeply rooted in Christian theology and teaching. I mean, thou shalt not kill is famously pointed to as the sixth commandment. But Romans 13 also instructs us that the government bears the sword as God's servant to uphold righteousness and to judge the wrongdoer. So this can be confusing. In this episode, what I'd like to do is to untangle some of the different issues wrapped up in this discussion. So here's my outline for how we'd like to go about it. In today's video, first, should Christians go to war at all? Now, there have been movements within certain subgroups of the church that believe that the Sixth Commandment and other passages preclude Christians from participating in any type of war. They believe pacifism is always mandated. Now, is this true? How do we understand things like thou shalt not kill in light of passages like Romans 13? And is the pacifist position actually coherent? Secondly, I think we need to understand and define just what just war theory means. What is it? Where did it come from? How have Christians historically understood both war and the need for constraints about war? Lastly, we'll try to look at just how just war theory fits within the current conflict in the Middle East. And we need to ask, why now? Does Operation Epic Fury meet that just war criteria? What are the actual objectives to this operation, and what happens after the fighting stops? Now, as some of you may know, one of my affiliations is as a fellow of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics. And just last week, my colleague, Anthony Costello, had a great extensive sit-down talk with two experts in political and just war theory, Dr. Tim Milosch, who teaches just war tradition and political science at Biola University, and Dr. Keith Pavischek, a military affairs expert with a focus on just war theory and the ethics of war. He's a retired colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, and their nearly 2.5-hour discussion, as they covered much of this, was really engaging. Now, as the conversation can be at a very high level, well, I felt that it would be helpful to simply highlight some of their comments and make them a bit more accessible to a general audience. But they will provide the expertise in moving our discussion forward. So, let's get started. First of all, what is just war theory? Why do we need limits on war? Is there such a thing as limits on war? Well, the idea that one should have limits on acts in war is actually an old one. Even biblically, when one looks at God's instructions to Israel, before they even entered the promised land, they were cautioned as to how to approach warfare. Deuteronomy 20 is the primary text where God tells the nation of Israel that when they go to war, they should first think about their own citizens' well-being. Secondly, they should also think about the well-being of their enemies. They examined them. So let me give you a couple of examples for this. For example, Deuteronomy 26 and 7 talk about a person who's betrothed to be married and how this young individual may opt out, or he may seek an exemption, I should say, from serving in combat. The idea is that you don't want to risk everyone's life needlessly, so that people can have a hope for their future. In verse 10 of Deuteronomy 20, God instructs the nation that when they approach an enemy city, they should first offer terms of peace. And if that enemy rejects those terms, that's when it's necessary to go to war. But even then, there are provisions, preclusions. You shouldn't be just going out there and slaughtering everybody. Women and children were to be set aside as captives. They weren't necessarily to be just destroyed. This is far different than many of the other ancient cultures. As a matter of fact, when we read about the Assyrians and when they came in and conquered Israel, their acts of warfare were just hideous. They would throw up infants and catch them on their spears, and they would rip young women's, pregnant women's wombs open, and all kinds of hideous things. And, you know, we shudder at that, but really that's not a whole lot different than what we saw happen to those folks in Israel on October 7th as Hamas ran amok during their raid. So the point with Deuteronomy 7, though, is that these are general rules of warfare. Now, they're couched in a Near Eastern ancient framework, certainly, but there were general rules. There were also some exceptions to those rules. For example, when they were coming in to take the land away from the Canaanites, there was a judgment that was applied to this, which had God calling for the elimination of all people, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So there are general frameworks for war, and the Christian culture and the Jewish culture are not the only cultures to have seen this. There have been other Roman and Greek cultures who have also talked about limits on war, because any strong civilization can understand that if you just say all's fair in war, the ability of people to run wild and unleash the most monstrous of acts against other human beings, well, it's unstoppable. So all cultures have had some kind of recognition of what it means to have a limit on warfare, but most cultures don't understand it in the way that the Judeo-Christian framework does, and especially the Christian framework that came out of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. But you may ask, before we get into those details, how do Christians understand war and these commands in light of Jesus' admonition not to kill, in light of Jesus' admonition to love your neighbor? Are Christians excluded from war because of the biblical teachings? I mean, many Christians will ask for an exemption or a conscientious objection to war because of this, and there are certain sects who do this as well that take it up as a theological framework. In fact, if we look at 3 primary texts that deal with this issue, Christians or Christian groups will point to, usually it's the 6th commandment. It's the idea that Jesus says that one must turn the other cheek in his Sermon on the Mount, and the teaching to love others as ourselves. So I think as a precursor to our discussion on just war, we should at least tackle these ideas. First of all, what about the 6th commandment? What about thou shalt not kill? Well, I think most people recognize that there is a difference between killing and murder, and what the 6th commandment actually does is it prohibits murder or the unjustified killing of another one for the sake of personal gain or what have you. The authority of the state or even the authority of the local governing province has in its power a right to make sure that the lives of individuals are protected, and that can also carry with it capital punishment. Of course, Genesis 9, when after Noah lands the ark, God clearly says that by a man's blood, if he sheds a man's blood, by his blood he shall pay for it. So God sanctions capital punishment right after Noah's flood and the repopulation of the earth. There is a difference, of course, between self-defense. You know, if you slay someone because they're going to slay you, that's not breaking the 6th commandment. God's command to punish the Canaanites was another example, as I had mentioned, that when Israel was invading the new land of Canaan to establish it as the nation of Israel, God had told them that he had given the Canaanites more than enough time to repent of their evil deeds. And the things that they were doing were just absolutely unspeakable. I mean, having children to burn them on the fire and offer them up to idols and things of this nature. God said, you know, as the authority who gives and takes life, and God has the authority to give life to whom he desires, he has the authority to take life from whom he desires. He may do that by natural means, heart attack. He may do that by means of disease, or he may do that by means of famine, but he can also do that by means of a proxy, and Israel was the proxy. If it is justified for God to take a life through famine or through disease or through natural order, then it is just as justified for God to take a life via proxy. So, thou shalt not kill really is thou shalt not murder. Of course, governing agencies do have a reason to hold the sword, as I said, and we'll talk about Romans 13 in a little bit too. But they are not killing in the sense of murder. They're actually performing a punishment as a response to an action. And in warfare, that's just simply enacted upon a larger scale. Now, what about Jesus' specific teachings, though? What about loving one's neighbor or turning the other cheek? Well, part of the problem with these kinds of things and applying them in a political scenario is that they're personal admonitions. And while personal admonitions are those how we should react one with another individually, they don't necessarily scale to national levels. You can't necessarily act the same way in statecraft that you can in dealing with one-on-one. You may be willing, for example, to turn the other cheek and take an affront and suffer personally because another person, you know, is insulting you, or another person is actually going to maybe you're going to have to skip a meal because they've somehow swindled you out of money, and you feel that it would be somehow better for them to just get away with that as opposed to causing an uproar which may endanger more people or other individuals in the process. You can make that decision for yourself. What you can't do is you can't make that decision for your entire community. So when these things scale, when they become larger, it's impossible to apply those beyond just your personal response. And these admonitions, like I said, don't excuse allowing bad behavior. So, for example, loving one's neighbor does not mean allowing bad actors to flourish unchecked, right? If you see, there's a difference between turning your cheek to have it struck and seeing a man strike a 12-year-old girl's cheek on the other side of the street. If you're seeing someone act badly toward another, don't you have an obligation to step in and do something about that? And see, that changes the calculus a little bit. It's not as clear to say, oh, well, we just have to turn the other cheek. No, that other person is suffering. That other person needs deliverance. That's no longer just to ignore it. And even to oneself. In fact, when Jesus was unjustly struck, when he was standing trial in the book of John, and the guard struck him on the cheek, John 18:22 says, when Jesus had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" And Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, then bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" So even here, Jesus himself says, we don't take these things woodenly. We don't take them always literally. If somebody's acting improperly, and that's clearly what was happening with Jesus, he didn't deserve to be struck. He was answering in a bad situation. He was answering the way he needed to answer. But he challenged that. He didn't just roll over and say, do it again. So these kinds of aphorisms don't necessarily play out in a wooden way. Now, let's get to the opposite claim, though. The other passage that we have to take into account along with those passages in our calculus is Romans 13. And it's always been a fascinating verse that talks about governing authorities. It's especially fascinating knowing that the Apostle Paul is writing Romans 13 when Nero is emperor. Nero is no friend to Christians. He had a lot of persecution for different Christian groups going on. Matter of fact, he famously blamed the fire in Rome on the Christian quarter because the Christian quarter was one of the ones that didn't get burned. But the Apostle Paul still writes that there is a order to government and there is an authority that they hold. And in Romans 13, starting in verse 1, he writes, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." So you see what the Apostle Paul is doing here. He's saying that most people, most rulers, it's even in their best interest to keep their society running well without a lot of problems. And good conduct creates well societies. So rulers are not a terror to people doing the right things for the most part. What they do, though, is they provide a check against those who would do bad acts. And he goes on to argue, would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Well, then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So this is the famous government passage on Romans 13, and Paul is clearly saying that we have to understand and recognize that providentially God has put governing authorities in that position as a proxy to, for the most part, act in a way to keep order and to keep evil at bay, I guess is the way I would say it. And when they say the government, he bears the sword for no reason, in other words, he has the authority to mete out punishment, and that punishment would include capital punishment. It would also include the ability to go to war. Augustine and others would extend this and say this is where war is appropriately understood. It is a governmental action, one people group among or against another. Now, here's the problem. When we're wrestling with this as Christians, how do we reconcile these verses? Well, it starts off with an easy question. Are people wicked? And I think that we can all answer that question pretty easily. Yes, of course, we live in a fallen world. People are wicked. People become selfish. People are always want to do those things that benefit them, and many times, even if it's at the expense of another. That's just how people are wired. So if it is a fact of this fallen world that people are wicked, then how do Christians mitigate the wickedness of these nations of the world? If certain nations would be wicked. I mean, again, the Canaanites were the primary example, but we can even see it today. Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans. Similarly, the Ayatollahs were, hideously famous for being the sponsors of terror throughout the world. You have ISIS. You have many different points where we can show how these wicked individuals and wicked groups would run amok and cause havoc. Now, God used Israel to mete out justice upon the Canaanite tribes, and God also used Babylon to mete out judgment upon sinful Israel. So here are two examples of God using one nation to punish another nation. And that's what we see. This is the concept behind Romans 13, is that nations can punish other nations. The problem with Babylon, by the way, wasn't that they conquered Israel. That's not why Babylon got overthrown. What God said when he promised that Babylon, in the book of Isaiah, when he promises that Babylon would be conquered, was the problem with Babylon is they did it with too much glee. They liked it too much. They did it. They didn't restrain themselves. They acted cruelly. And because of that, they were then overthrown as well. Now, in the 4th, 5th century, as the Roman Empire became Christian, people started discussing this. Of course, Rome is famous in its Roman legions and had conquered the world via war. How do we understand war now that Rome is Christian, and how do we make sense of all of this? Well, St. Augustine starts writing upon this, and you read a lot against the Manichaeans in his letters against the Manichaeans, also in his book, The City of God. And he starts commenting on war, and what he notes are a few things. First of all, he notes that an individual engaged in war is not himself violating the 6th commandment. You are acting as a representative of the larger nation, and again, that authority granted to that nation is appropriate. So he understands that that's not necessarily you killing. He also argues that obedience to the Lord means an understanding, a nuanced view of the commandments, that we can't take these things too woodenly. Matter of fact, Augustine points to this injunction: if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. He said, what is here required is not a bodily action, but an inward disposition. The sacred seat of virtue is the heart. And I think that's correct. I think that when you're thinking about warfare and things of this nature, it's not to have glee in the act of warfare itself. You shouldn't get all excited, oh boy, I get to kill people. That's not the proper attitude. What the proper attitude is, though, is to understand that you are meting out punishment just the way a police officer would. You try to de-escalate, if you're in a warfare situation. Yes, combatants are fair game, but you don't try to go beyond that. You don't have to, burn down the entire village per se if there's no strategic reason to do so. There's all these things that you have that inward disposition of understanding that this is a necessary action to take, but it's not something that we revel in. So, for example, they give you a thought experiment. Consider a man hitting a boy and another man caressing a boy. Now, the first case seems bad, but the man might be a father lovingly disciplining his son, might be giving him a spanking. The second case seems good, but the man might be a child molester. So this is where Augustine's inward disposition kind of comes to play. Augustine said, "We may find a man by charity made fierce, and by iniquity made winningly gentle." And that's that parallel that you see. So this is what Augustine is trying to argue. He's trying to say that you have to, it's really your inward thoughts, it's your inward position, because God judges the soul. The ultimate question is not, quote, what the man does, but what mind and with what will he does it. The appropriate motive in all cases is love, and what is done from love of God must be good. And you can do this in war as well, right? If, for example, if we had known, and I think there were reactions at the end of World War II, but when you see how the Jewish populations were just absolutely decimated, they were killed, slaughtered left and right by the Nazis. It is simply the right thing to go and free those people and to get rid of the SS or whomever is the ones doing that just terrible Holocaust against them. So the concept again is that for thou shalt not kill, that there is no private right to kill, but God can and does command the right to killing others. As I said, God allows governments the ability to bear sword. And this is another big issue that Augustine starts to say. You can't, if you're a captain of industry or, the leader of I'm Italian. So, right. So there's the whole stigma of the mafia with the Italians, and you want to take your family to get head. You do not have the right, just as the head of any organization, to take the life of another for whatever reason, even if they say took the life of one of yours. You don't have that right. There is governments that bear the ability to do so because they are entrusted with a sword, but there's not an authority that gives you the opportunity for vengeance in that way of your own doing, right? Vigilantism is a problem. You have to have an international kind of recognition. You have to at least have a high level of understanding of that you represent an entire people group in that way. So Augustine says, they who have waged war in obedience to the divine command or in conformity with his laws, they have represented in their persons the public justice or the wisdom of government. And in this capacity have to put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. So you hear how that works. So the idea that somehow war is somehow violating the sixth commandment really doesn't make much sense. However, there are those who would hold that that may be true for regular governments, because regular governments have to act within the crudity of their own understanding, but the Christian is called to a higher standard. In fact, the idea of pacifism has always played a part in some sects of Christianity, the Anabaptist tradition, and things of that nature. And it's something that I think we need to talk about. So what I want to do is I'll play a clip here from that podcast that I talked about with my colleague Anthony Costello, as well as Dr. Tim Milosch and Keith Pavischek, and they talk a little bit about pacifism. And this is Keith Pavischek primarily making this point. So let's watch.
The sword, they said, of course, the metaphor of the sword in Romans 13, is ordained outside the perfection of Christ. It's a very important theological phrase, outside the perfection of Christ. It's outside the perfection of Christ because the only discipline available to the Christian church is the ban, excommunication, et cetera, et cetera. And then they ask, well, so it will be asked concerning the sword, shall one be a magistrate if one is chosen as such? And basically the answer is no. But you can't, in other words, you can't be the magistrate that bears the sword. But then they take it a step further. Can you serve in any political office? Now, they had enough integrity to understand that any political office with any authority requires bearing the sword, right? To punish evil and to do good. Romans 13 was too clear for that. Yeah. In fact, in the area where they said, and this is the 6th article, I'm going to read this, so I apologize for it. I want to read exactly what they said. The sword is ordained of God outside the perfection of Christ. It punishes and puts to death the wicked and guards and protects the good. In the law, the sword was ordained for the punishment of the wicked and for their death, and the same sword is now ordained to be used by worldly magistrates. I usually pause right there, like when I'm at one of these academic conferences, and I say something like, "Well, they don't make Mennonites like they used to." Right, and then
right, okay.
The pacifist gets really upset.
Yes.
But then they say how. So then they say, in the perfection of Christ, however, only the ban is used for a warning and for the excommunication of the one who has sinned without putting the flesh to death. So what we're dealing with here is a radical dualism, right? Flesh. So it's like the government and the state is flesh. The body of Christ is spirit,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's radically dualism, right?
Nary shall the two meet, right?
Yeah. So this is classical pacifism. The important thing is to understand is they understood that in order to be consistently with this position, they couldn't just say we're not going to bear the sword by being a police officer, like a local magistrate who bears a sword, or a soldier, but we can't do politics.
Politics.
They prescind from those worldly areas, right, to live their lives, without getting involved in that kind of thing. And so we still see similar echoes of this in Amish communities or
Amish community, right.
But
there, at the same time, there's an allowance there of the worldly magistrate to do what the worldly magistrate does vis-a-vis the world, right? Which is bear the sword. There's not a challenge, an ongoing challenge by the spiritual body of Christ to say, stop, you can't do this, and so on and so forth.
That's the first point. The second point, and this will begin to get into just war theory, is understanding why that was rejected in an ecumenical fashion. All the magisterial reformers rejected that. Roman Catholics rejected that. So when you hear people like Stanley Hauerwas ranting on about Constantinianism, what he's saying is all the reformers and that are reject that because they're too worldly or whatever. But and I've written particularly try to I'm not the only one, but if you understand why Calvin, for instance, rejected it because he thought it was crazy. I mean, he said they're saying that what God is requiring of the civil magistrate, that you tell me Christians can't hold the office that God has established to do good and punish evil. He thought that was really strange. At length,
it's handing the world over to the world, right? It's handing. governance of literally handing the governance of the world over to the wicked.
Yeah, and he thought
in some way.
Yeah, and Calvin thought that it really bizarre that Scripture holds a righteous magistrate like way up here, and he found it odd that Christians couldn't fulfill that office, but they could fill other offices like bakers and candlestick makers and all this. So he, right. And in the polemics of the day, he said things like, like what kind of a knucklehead, things like that.
Okay, so there you see. I think Keith Pavischek does a really good job here to talk about this idea that only in this pacifistic tradition, that if you're going to take the view that while Romans 13, you can either deny Romans 13, in which you've got a whole other set of problems. You've got a problem that Paul made a mistake here, and that calls into question all kinds of theology across the entire biblical realm. Or you could say Paul didn't make a mistake, but he wasn't talking about Christians. He was talking about the world. And the sword is ordained to those people outside the perfection of Christ. That's government. Christians have their own method of discipline, right? The Matthew 18, go with another person, 2 or 3. You can be excommunicated, essentially thrown out with the sinners and the tax collectors. The whole Matthew 18 chain of events. But as he pointed out, I think that doesn't make any sense. Why would God create an office for adjudicating against evil, which is what government is, and then bar the righteous from being able to obtain to that office? Wouldn't you want the Christians, more so than the rest of the world, being the ones to administer justice, because they're much more likely to administer it according to the precepts of war, or of Jesus' teachings, I should say, right? They're going to approach it as best they can, if they're faithful Christians. They're going to approach it the way Jesus taught. They're going to see people, for example, as bearing the image of God, all people having inestimable worth. All of these things that we've recognized and that took us sometimes centuries to kind of develop within our cultural systems. I mean, even if you think about slavery and all the difficulty that was, that came about ultimately because Christians in political office pushed for it. So to say that this doesn't apply, this Romans 13 shouldn't apply to Christians and they have a different set of standards, that it seems to me that by claiming pacifism, you're actually causing more evil to develop in the world, because you're saying only non-Christians, only those who aren't saved, only those who don't know and are not part of the kingdom of God can mete out justice to the world. That just doesn't make any sense. I kind of agree with Calvin. I think that's crazy. So, we bear the sword as governments in order to go to war. Okay, so going to war is at least biblically justified. But we can't stop there. It's not, okay, we can go to war, so let's do everything. So, as I said, what happened as we start to apply these things, as we start to take the different aspects of what it means to be a human, what it means to be a Christian, how justice is administered, we pull all these things together and we say, we have to understand what it means to go to war justly. And Augustine has talked already about what the motivation of the heart is. One, I think we have to understand is we recognize that war is a real aspect of human existence. Until Jesus comes and vanquishes evil, there will always be war, right? There will be wars and rumors of wars, he says, but the end is not yet. And if there's always going to be war, then the question becomes, how do we deal with it? What we need to do in any situation where we're not faced with a perfect condition, we have to try and mitigate it with the best way we know how. And sometimes that's not a really great answer. For example, any child who've lost both their parents, right? Orphans, or those whose parents have been jailed, or maybe the children has been taken away by Child Protective Services because the parents are in danger. That's not a good situation. You always would want to have a child be with their biological mother and father. That's the best situation that a child can thrive in. However, it's not always possible, given the circumstances I talked about above. So what we try to do is we try to figure out, well, what can we do to minimize the bad, the negative effects? And with war, that's what we try to do as well. There will always be war. How can we minimize it? How can we come at it in such a way to constrain it, so to make sure that it doesn't run amok, to make sure that we're on at least the right side of war as much as we possibly can be? Now, this is interesting because a couple of assumptions follow from this. First of all, people assume in discussions sometimes that war is the worst thing there is. War is just, right, terrible. And you've heard, of course, the famous quote, war is hell. And I understand that. War is very difficult. Like I said, it's not the optimal. We don't want that to happen. But it's not necessarily the worst thing there is. I mean, imagine abject servitude for the rest of your life in some way, right? The famous Nathan Hale, give me liberty or give me death phrase. Why did he say that? Because all of the revolutionary fighters, we're getting ready to celebrate the 250th year of our independence, signing of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. They recognized that liberty has a cost, and liberty is valuable enough that war may be a necessary component of that cost. So war is not necessarily the worst thing that one can ascribe to, but it's there. It's part of the human condition, and we need to limit it. Now, individuals, I think, who would hold to this and accept this, when we talk about other aspects of the human condition for most of society that we actually have vanquished, they don't see those as the same. So let me give you an example. One of the things, and this is just an aside, one of the things that I've noticed is that whenever we talk about slavery, the objection always shows up as to, well, why does the Bible allow slavery? They give you all these rules for the slaves you can have and the slaves you can't have. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay. But slavery for most of humanity was much like war. It was just assumed to always have been, always will be. The fact that Christianity came along, and it was the Christians, especially William Wilberforce and others, who were the first to ban slavery, the first organized societies to ban slavery, that is the anomaly of the human condition. So what God was trying to do with slavery was to put limits on it, just like what God is trying to do with war is to put limits on it. Now, people don't say, how come you're trying to put, God, by telling you can't do this, you can't do that. Anyway, it's interesting how you don't use the same method of application in one version, in one aspect or one point of contention of humanity to another. But war isn't necessarily the worst thing there is. It always has dire consequences, of course. And so we have to start asking ourselves, how should people approach war so that we can recognize the necessity of regulating it while minimizing the evils that war produces? And this is where just war gets its seed. This is where it gets its impetus, right? So Augustine in the City of God recognizes that wars, for example, should serve peace rather than aggression. This is one of his primary ideas. In City of God 19.7, he writes this: "For it is the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise man to wage just wars." So somebody else violates something. They do wrong. He goes on to say, and this wrongdoing, even though it gave rise to no war, would still be matter of grief to man because it is man's wrongdoing. So take Russia and Ukraine. When Russia unilaterally invades Ukraine, that's just a wrongdoing. And it is considered just for Ukraine to defend itself, to go to war against Russia. Just flat out. That's not even a question. When Hamas on October 7th crosses the border and starts, slaughtering people wholesale, grandparents, babies, raping women, decapitating people, mutilating people, that is a grief to man because it's man's wrongdoing. Whether or not Israel goes to war or not, that's just in fact wrong. The way that many have summarized this quote is to say, just wars are a response to an evil act, not simply to gain land, to gain glory, riches, or to restore honor. So basically, just wars are those that are in response to other evils that are necessary to provide a counter to the evil that other people act, right? And there are real evils in the world. People do real evils, and evil needs to be answered. That's what justice is. Augustine also goes on to say, quote, "The real evils in war are love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, and the lust of power and such like. And it is generally to punish these things that when force is required to inflict the punishment, that in obedience to God or to some other lawful authorities, good men undertake wars. When they find themselves in such a position as regards to the conduct of human affairs, that right conduct requires them to act or to make others act, and in this way." Now that was quoted from his reply to Faustus the Manichaean, 22.74. That's where you find that quote. But I think Augustine has it right there, that, again, he's talking about how you yourself respond in such a way. It is necessary for justice to exist, for evil acts to be answered. And that may mean going to war if the evil act is provided by a nation. There are many different aspects of just war theory that you can find in Augustine. He doesn't tie them all together, but if you go through his writings, you find them. It wasn't really until Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century came along. What he did was he actually kind of systematized all of Augustine's writing, and he thought a little bit about it, added some of his own stuff. And when we talk about just war theory, we usually start with Thomas Aquinas' formulation of it. Now, modern just war theory has grown and shifted and kind of been shaped by a lot of thinking, but most of these are pretty consistent. And the primary conditions, what we call the deontological positions, those things that are just taken. And again, in these clips, you're going to hear some of these big words, but there are certain necessary conditions, certain three big factors that really define whether you're undergoing a just war. And it's just cause, right authority, and right intention. And let me play you a clip, the next clip from our podcast, and see why it's important to understand that you can't just go through a checklist and think that, as long as you check off these 6 or 7 criteria, that's all you need, because it's not as simple as that. So let's listen.
When I first started working on this stuff, we're invited to think about just war theory in terms of a checklist. I think that is very problematic, but it's not entirely false, because you have to kind of understand that it's more than that. It's inviting us to think morally about statecraft and the use of force. But the classic statement, and you find this in, it's actually summarized quite well in Aquinas, right? That when you're considering going to war, you have to have a just cause with right authority and right intention. Okay, these, the great just war scholar James Turner Johnson called the deontological criteria of the just war tradition. Okay, so just cause, right authority, right intention. In a second, I'll describe what those classically meant. But then, as the tradition developed, some other what would appropriately be called prudential criteria were added. That's proportionality of ends, last resort, reasonable hope of success, and the aim of peace. So, in the questions you put out, you asked, like, what are more important? I don't know if important is the right word, but classically, the ontological criteria of just cause, right authority, and right intention are the strict moral questions you have to ask. Mm-hmm. And, every once in a while, somebody writes something and a light bulb goes on. Well, it was back in the 90s when James Turner Johnson pointed out in a piece how the just cause, right authority, and right intention are pegged, right, to the political goods of justice, order, and peace. Justice, order, and peace that are to be secured by the political community. And it's not insignificant that when Aquinas asked this question, I think Augustine too, but Aquinas, what's he start with? What's the first criteria? Right authority. Mm-hmm. Now, when I started studying this in the 80s and 90s, right authority was the Rodney Dangerfield criterion. It's like, it's right authority, right? It's like, yeah, of course. It was like nobody paid attention. Everybody wanted to jump to just cause and right intention. What is right authority? Classically, it meant reservation. And I'm reading this from some notes because I want to get it exactly straight. At one time, I had all this memorized. Reservation of the right to employ force to persons or communities with no political superior. Sovereign political entities. Now, that could reside in a king. It could reside in a king and an aristocracy of nobles, or whatever the internal constitution is. There's no higher authority, right? And what that means is it's that authority that controls chain of command and has the right to exercise and maneuver forces, call an end to the use of force. That's all it means. Now, but that point is a great advance in the history of Christian thought. Why? Because what it does, it takes away from lesser authorities the right to wage private war.
I think that's a great point. So again, what Keith is saying is this is an amazing advance in ethics as Christianity starts to say, no, just because you're a baron and you control large swaths of land, that doesn't mean that you can go to war against another baron. That there's someone above you who should adjudicate these things. Now, if you're at the top, and nations, by their nature, have no one above them but God to answer to. Think about the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel answered to God, and God recognizes the sovereignty of specific nations and the differentiation of those nations, how they approach things, in a way so that they do have the authority, and it's waged by a legitimate authority. Aquinas says it this way: a war is just only if it is waged by a legitimate authority. Even just causes cannot be served by actions taken by individuals or groups who do not constitute authority sanctioned by whatever the society and outsiders to that society deem legitimate. So it has to be a legitimate authority. It has to be a nation. But he makes a couple of points there. It is, the decision happens at the national level, and how that decision is deemed may be a little bit different than the decision itself. And that's one of the questions we have with this sanction, this happening today, is because President Trump, ordered Operation Epic Fury. But to truly go to war, to be in a state of war, it requires an act of Congress. And there's debate about this. There's folks who are arguing back and forth as to whether this is legitimate. Well, the trouble here is there are tensions in this because the president does have some authority to do limited actions. He is the chief of the armed forces, right? He's the commander-in-chief. That is what his role is. And he can unilaterally take some actions as long as they don't incur an ongoing, they don't basically continue into a war. And the lines are fuzzy, and we're going to talk a little bit about this down the road, because part of the struggle that we have in this is, as bystanders, second and third level people, we aren't hearing the whole story. And so we'll debate about this more, but at least I want you to get the understanding that the legitimate authority level is that happens at the national level, at that higher level where there's no authority above that individual save God. So again, right cause, right intention, legitimate authority. We talked about legitimate authority, but what about right cause and right intention? Well, Augustine covers both of these when he writes, "A just war can only be fought to redress a wrong suffered." So you hear, again, Aquinas is writing this, but you hear echoes of Augustine in it. A just war can only be fought to redress wrong suffered. For example, self-defense against an armed attack is always considered to be a just cause. Now, it might not be, the justice of the cause might not be sufficient enough to call a war. There might be other mitigating circumstances. But he says, further, a just war can only be fought with right intentions. The only permissible objective of a just war is to redress the injury. It's not for vengeance sake. And again, this goes back to Augustine's idea that it's motivations of the heart that we're talking about, not simply, I want to get that guy, or I hate them, or what have you. They did this to me, so they have to have it done back to them, that kind of thing. Now, there are also these prudential criteria that we're talking about, and these additional things that you heard them mention. And I'll go through those as well, and we'll listen to what they think, how they think these play out in this war. So, for example, Aquinas writes, "The ultimate goal of a just war is to reestablish peace. More specifically, the peace established after the war must be preferable to the peace that would have prevailed if the war had not been fought." So to some degree, you want to make sure that what you're doing is not making things worse for fighting the war. You have to, there may be people who are under subjugation. So, for example, let's take North Korea, for example. It's clear that Kim Jong-un is a tyrant. But in trying to go to war with him because of his tyranny, chances are his people would suffer worse. The people of South Korea would suffer worse. It might turn into a nuclear conflict. It just might be worse all the way around. So while there might be an objectively appropriate way to say this is a tyrant and he's doing things that are unjust, we also have to caution that, well, what are the outcomes? What's it going to be? Will it be peace? And will the peace that we have afterwards, yeah, we can beat North Korea, but at what cost? And that's another point Aquinas makes, that a war can only be just if it's fought with a reasonable chance of success. So it has to have a motive of peace, and hopefully the peace at the end is better than the peace at the beginning. It should be fought with a reasonable chance of success. Death and injuries incurred in a hopeless cause are not morally justifiable. If you're just going to slaughter everybody, then why are you doing it? That doesn't make any sense. Another point, a just war can only be waged as a last resort. All nonviolent options must be exhausted before the use of force can be justified. And then the violence used in war must be proportional to the injury suffered. You can't blow up an entire country just because they dropped one bomb. States are prohibited from using force not necessary to obtain the limited objective of addressing the injury suffered. So if you can't, you have to have a mode of proportionality. Also, the weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Civilians are never permissible targets of war, and every effort must be taken to avoid killing civilians. Notice that it's not saying that every effort that civilians should never be killed in war, because that's impossible. But you try to take efforts to avoid killing civilians. The deaths of civilians are justified only if they are unavoidable victims of a deliberate attack on a military target. And so those are the providential criteria. Now, part of the difficulty with this and why this can't simply be a checklist, as Keith Pavischek noted, was that we as members of the public are not privy, number one, to the intel that is happening at the highest levels of government. And this is one of the reasons why government has to be able to be the ones to make these decisions. So we don't know some of these reports back. For example, when Israel retaliated against Hamas in Gaza, and there was a report, these people are blowing up hospitals. Well, it turns out, there was a bunker there. They were firing rockets from the hospital. That's what they were doing. And Israel said, I am not going to let my people die because they're shooting from a hospital zone, which they shouldn't be doing. I'm going to take out their rocket cannons. It's just that simple. So that's one of those things that happen. But sometimes in the heat of battle, you as a third party or as an outsider, you can't see that ahead of time. Sometimes propaganda or rhetoric can play a part. So psychological warfare. Sometimes we were here, and Trump does this all the time, where he will give conflicting statements, and the enemy simply does not know what to believe. Sometimes he'll make a threat and then he'll back off on it. And I think sometimes he does that deliberately to just keep people off balance and trying to understand where he's going. It can be a very effective tactical strategy. Is it? Now the problem with our press is they seem to assume that all those statements are just him being confused or being, talking in a way that he's evil. There's all kinds of problems with it. And look, it's difficult to sift through all of what Trump says. I don't necessarily hold to all the things that Trump says. I don't believe that that everything he says should be believed. I don't believe everything that he says is appropriate. But I do think that sometimes he plays this game very, very well. And there are certain criteria that we just don't know. As a matter of fact, I was reading one article where they said 2/3 of the data that we would need in order to kind of dispassionately go through our checklist on what just war theory criteria meets. We just don't have that data in an easy way. But we do have some data. It's not like we don't have anything. So how does just war theory fit within the attacks on Iran? Does Operation Epic Fury meet any just war criteria? And again, we're going to talk about just cause, right authority, right intention. But as Tim Milosch talks about, he first starts with the war of last resort. So let's watch that one.
Well, let's get to Iran, and I'll just put it out there simply. Why Iran and why now? From this just war, from a just war perspective.
Well, certainly, I'm going to actually do what we've just been critiquing. Let's put the prudential criteria first. If we're going to get nitpicky about things like last resort, it's really hard to make the argument that there's still more that could be done when this war has been 40 plus years in the making. So, I'll just frame that up, and just to give, and the reason I do that is I want people to understand where I'm coming from. Is I'm looking at the history of America's relationship with the Iranian regime, and basically what you have from 1979 to now is an unremitting campaign of asymmetric warfare from between Iran and America, promulgated by the Iranian regime, grounded in a well, you mentioned earlier, Keith, the problem of trying to make the eschaton imminent. That's exactly the theological framework the Ayatollahs are working out of. They are making the eschaton imminent, and so to that end, the destruction of America and Israel is necessary. So there can be no real political peace between a regime that has that perspective of your regime.
Okay, let me unpack that for you a little bit, and then we'll go on. What does he mean by making the eschaton imminent? Those are again a couple of good theological words. Basically, what he's saying is that the war is being fought within the IRI's mindset. That's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, the Ayatollahs, those people in that high command, they are all Shia Muslims. They're all trying to establish a theocracy in their country. It was a violent overthrow of the Shah. The Iran, up until 1979, was much like Turkey in the sense that it was a more secular, more Western adopting framework. Yeah, they had a lot of Middle East issues, and U.S. oil companies, British were first, came in there and started establishing houses and things like that. And it was actually fairly modern looking up until the overthrow of the Shah. But when that happened, it wasn't just an economic thing, it was a religious overthrow. And what these folks believe, they believe that in order for the last caliph to come, their kind of Messiah figure, in order for him to arrive, in order for those last days and the glory of Allah to be shown, the great Satans must be vanquished. And as the great Satans, they're talking about Israel and the United States. And they have said this explicitly. They have said this repeatedly. And for the last 40 years, as Tim has said, they have worked out criteria by which they hope to whittle us away to the point of where we would collapse. It was the holding of the hostages for 444 days. It was the 1983 Beirut bombing. Right? Iran has continually and consistently funded terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East to go then throughout the world and to continue to develop this. But that's the whole point, is that what they're doing is motivated by religion. Tim goes on in this clip to explain a little bit more about how religious motivation is so important, but how the Western media and those, even many within the power structures and those who make the decisions in the West, are missing it because the people in the West don't understand the power of religious motivation. So here we go.
Finally, the nature of the regime is terrorist. And this is
terrorist and as religious eschatological. Yeah. I mean, I never see anybody ever talk about something like what the theological motivations of the regime and the return of the Mahdi.
If you're a realist,
this is like, how is this not like? I don't know if people they don't want to go in on that point
because
it's religious, but
but Keith just said it. It's because if your framework is classical realism, theological framework doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. Theological motivation doesn't matter. So and that's, by the way, that's a lot of the foreign policy journalists are going to go through that framework.
Well, look, I remember. Correct me if I'm wrong, Keith. But didn't Obama make some kind of claim that climate change was a force, like a force, augmented, or augmenting the ISIS's operations, because it was almost like he was trying to make a connection between climate change and the internal motivation for ISIS to conduct its terrorist operations.
Well, it's the same as making the discredited claim that it's poverty that drives people into terrorism.
It's always poverty,
right? Like it's poverty, it's climate change. And I think what you see in that, what you see in that is a grasping for an explanation. There's a recognition that there's something that motivates Islamic jihadists that the Western mind doesn't recognize. The secular Western mind just doesn't recognize. They're not historical materialists. They're not empiricists. They're being motivated by something else. But because the West has largely lost, and especially Western elites, decision makers, policymakers, academics, journalists, have largely lost the theological frame and the ability to even see it as a legitimate what's the word I'm looking for? A legitimate epistemological and decision-making framework. It's not even considered. I get pretty amped up on this because this was actually a component of my dissertation. Because one of the basic claim in my dissertation that I was trying to demonstrate is that international relations theory in America, in the American Academy in particular, is because it's so heavily quantitative based, because it's so heavily grounded in empiricism, it tends to place variables of culture, which includes theology and values, in it. That's a statistical error. That's an error term. That's just part of they literally classify that as the noise in their statistical models when they're trying to explain sources of conflict and everything. So what that does is it creates this analytical hole in which you're trying to explain motivation and decision making. Why won't the Iranians come to the table after getting pulverized? Why do they ignore their own people, mow them down by the thousands when they're protesting economic conditions and mismanagement? Why would they do that after even getting partial sanctions relief? And the only way you can explain that is because they're true believers. They're committed to this theological framework that says these are your two major enemies. You must defeat them in order to bring about the eschaton. And this is how they're going to go about doing it. And, if their own people don't seem to get that, well, that's their problem. Maybe they deserve to die.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear. I think Tim does a good job of explaining that. And again, it is noticeable by its absence across most of the reports today. So in these criteria, last resort, is this a waging war, is that the last resort? Yeah, we've done sanctions. We've done tried diplomatic. We've tried international, restrictions on atomic weapons, and in every single case, they've been ignored. They've been just bypassed by the Iranian regime. So what about just cause, right authority, and right attention? Well, our experts talked about that too. Matter of fact, Tim says, well, the reason he goes straight to last resort because these other three, we've got way too much history to show any other case.
So that's the backdrop to this. The biggest frustration I've had over the last 2 weeks has been that piece just being completely ignored, that the current conflict is being looked at entirely in a vacuum of not even the first Trump administration. Even if you wanted to go back to the first Trump administration and look at the attack that killed Qasem Soleimani, you find there the seeds for a just cause. Because no one disputed the fact that Soleimani, a commanding general in the IRGC, was in Iraq to do operational planning for killing Americans. The fact of the matter is if and the reason I'm starting with the prudential stuff is because I think even the critics of this conflict actually know that they can't argue the deontological criteria. When we talk about just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, those things I think are pretty settled on this conflict. The entity that is promulgating the conflict is the American military. Now, we can talk about the legal authorities of the president and everything in there, but even the way I described it to my students at Biola is the moral and ethical, like the just cause component, that's clear. If you want to talk about legitimate authority and the legal authority of the president, there's at least a reasonable legal basis. There can be arguments and quibbles, but there's a reasonable legal basis, at which point you have to start talking about right intention. What's the end game here? And this is where you've seen a lot of public debate, or the attempts at public debate, to say like, well, what's the objective? What's the Trump administration doing? They're not really clear about this. I would argue, and I'm hopeful this piece will go live soon for Providence, and article I just wrote for them. I argue that actually the Trump administration has been pretty darn clear about what the intention is. The intention is that you can't have a nuclear Iran. You can't have an Iran that threatens the region and Israel with their ballistic missiles, and you can't have an Iran promulgating in regional stability with proxy terrorist groups. And so far, that's what we're targeting. So I think it's pretty clear. It seems like the deontological criteria have all been nailed and are checked off, to use the checklist, which means the debate functions at the prudential level here primarily. But Keith, I'll let you weigh in.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you said. I mean, I think the case can be made that we've been in a state, we, U.S., certainly Israel, our ally and us, have been in a state of bellum with the Iranian regime since 1979.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I know why there will be resistance to that, right? Because there are, throughout those 47 years, there have been intermittent attempts to deal with the problem kinetically and non-kinetically, diplomatically and economically and other ways. But if I really need to get down into brass tacks, I'd say that we've been in a state of bellum, if not in a state of active kinetic. And so in a way, I'd say you don't even have to look at the deontological criteria. They've all, we're in a state of war.
You're already
it's
there.
been long satisfied.
We're in a state of bellum.
Okay, so there you have it. And I think that's appropriate. I think that when we look at the 47 years of diplomatic attempts, outreaches, sanctions, things like that, you can't argue that we've not tried over and over and over again, and that all attempts have had Iran simply continue to move forward. Now, is there a reasonable chance of success? We haven't talked about that. Well, I think that's been pretty clear by what we've seen. For example, CENTCOM, the Center of Command, had issued a report that said that Operation Epic Fury, and I'm going to quote this, quote, was launched by the United States on February 28th against the state of Iran. And this is as of March 16th, this report came out. And it said, and joined by Israel as a fighting partner. Since then, the U.S. has blown up thousands of ground targets, installations, headquarters, and many of the top leaders of the Iranian regime. It has included over 7,000 targets struck, 6,500 combat flights, and over 100 Iranian vessels damaged or destroyed, according to figures released by the U.S. Central Command as of March 3rd. And so you see that they are actually... they're approaching this very strategically, very much with a scalpel, and they are not doing widespread violence. The violence is simply trying to knock out much or many of the military installations, those things that would threaten us, missile silos, bomb-making facilities, things like that. We are trying to make sure that that is proportional. And the goal, again, is to reestablish peace within the Middle East, where these terrorist groups no longer thrive. And that's the biggest point in all of this. Is it is not, by the way, the United States has not specifically claimed regime change. That's an important point, because while most of us would love to see it, many people believe that it's necessary, and this is a big question mark. We have the Shah's son, who's in exile right now, and he would love to step in and lead these people back to a more sane form of government. There are obviously thousands of Iranians who were protesting against the government, who wanted regime change. But it is not the goal of the United States to put in a new leader, a new puppet. That's never been one of the stated goals. The stated goals are what Tim had said, that no terrorist organizations threatening the Middle East, that there's no ballistic missiles being sent to Israel or other areas, and that there's no nuclear capability for Iran. Those are the goals, and those are the ways that we are approaching it. But lastly, I think some people ask, well, why now? Why do we do this now? I mean, there was no initial strike. There was no bombing. There was, couldn't we have waited longer? Well, let's go to our experts and hear what they have to say on that point.
Right. Why now? Okay. Last night and early this morning, I listened to I watched Frontline. And normally I'm very skeptical about what Frontline puts out, but they actually did a pretty good job, I must say, in sort of detailing 47 years of history with Iran and leading up to the strikes last summer, and so it was actually pretty good. A few quibbles here and there, but and it seemed to me that toward the end they got to the most salient moral question, and it had to do with whether the Israelis and the U.S. the current strike on Iran was preventive war, right? Or it was in some sense preemptive. Now those are some fine legal details, and the commentator, former defense national security advisor for Israel, said that after 10/7, the Israelis said that we're not going to play deterrence anymore. We played deterrence with Hamas. We played deterrence. The terminology is mowing the lawn, right? Mm-hmm. The strategy toward dealing with the Hamas threat was mowing the lawn, and then 10/7 happened, and it wasn't just Bibi. The entire defense establishment realized they screwed up. And because they believed that Hamas was contained, because they are now a de facto nation state and they would not risk all their power as a de facto government of Gaza, right, with what they did. And after that, the Israelis simply said, we can't afford to do this anymore. And in fact, that right after 10/7, the debate was over whether they were going to attack Hamas or whether the primary effort was going to be north against the Hezbollah. And the military and other people, and I think the Mossad wanted them to go after Hezbollah, right? But there's no way Bibi said, no, there's no way I cannot go at, right? And so they said. So I bring that up to just say that there are allies, and we backed our allies, maybe not as firmly as some of us wish that we did, but we did. Even Biden administration did. And so you've got the tentacles, the 8th Front War, 7th Front War, all these de facto, basically it's all Iranian proxies. So, and that just goes back to a couple years. That's even before you get to taking Marines and diplomats hostages, 1983, Beirut, which is personal, and so you can go easily enough find online the list of all the acts that counts as act of war, and then finally, activities. The nature of the regime is terrorist.
So, I think this is an important point. 10/7 was a game changer, and it showed that leaving the threat open, leaving the door open, could have dire consequences. Israel is our ally. They're someone we have to support. And that was also there. I think there was also an open window. There are certain members who follow the intelligence community who said that there was a strike window open when, for example, when all the leaders were in the same area, that was the only time where you could actually start this operation in any effective way and without, again, having more widespread damage. And I think that was another aspect to this point. But I think 10/7 was a game changer. Absolutely, it was. It was their 9/11, and 9/11 was a game changer for us. It made us think about the Middle East in a much different way. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope this has brought some illumination to you, especially on how you think about war and then how you think about this conflict. I'm not saying that it answers all the questions. It doesn't. War will always be tragic, and there are no clean victories, right? We live in a broken world. We have to make certain necessary decisions. Sometimes these decisions are hard. Sometimes they are the best we can make, but they still are not the best outcome we would like. They're just the best of bad options available to us. Just war theory doesn't make war good, but it does help us ask whether what we're doing is justified. So, when we come to Operation Epic Fury, we have to ask, can we approach it as a just war? Keith and Tim seem to make the argument that we can. I do think, though, that whenever we think about these conflicts, Christians shouldn't respond with either blind support or automatic outrage. I think we have to approach it more carefully, with moral reasoning, with thoughtfulness, with prayer. Again, we aren't trying to simply win arguments. We are seeking God's will for our lives. We are seeking to pursue justice. We want to make sure that we hold to our Christianity and glorify our God by also supporting his just causes. Now, what do you think? Do you agree with this? Do you think that we missed something? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so put them in the comments below. And until next time, this is Lenny Esposito, hoping you'll have a good day. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.